Hello, and welcome to a special episode where we are once more diving into the world of Final Fantasy VIII with a look at how the non-player cast contributes to storytelling, world building, and character development. But more so than that, it's an extra special episode because I'm excited to be joined today by a special guest. And frankly, I can't think of a better guest to have on when it comes to discussing Final Fantasy VIII. They are one of the most incisive commentators on the game today, who never fails to offer fresh theories, perspectives, and indeed fashion critiques on Squall and the gang, who they have appropriately dubbed the Squang. Always a joy to listen to, and one of my favourite YouTubers. It's a pleasure to introduce Gamedove. Welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such a beautiful introduction. Oh my goodness.
You're very welcome. I'm really looking forward to having this chat with you today, but at the risk of having undersold you a little bit there, is there anything you'd like to add about the sort of channel you have, the sort of content you produce?
Oh gosh. Yeah, well, if you're interested in Final Fantasy VIII, it's definitely the place for you. It's quite literally most of the things I talk about. I have a couple of videos on Final Fantasy Versus 13 because unfortunately I am a Versus 13 truther. And yeah, I love making videos about fashion and Final Fantasy fashion in particular, but really I don't think I can do a better job in that introduction. I think you may have oversold.
No, it's excellent. Yeah, I mean, such an eclectic mix of stuff. I'm always excited to see what you come up with.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, and particularly your most recent one as well, if I can plug that, because not only did you debut the Squang, the Squang coinage, but you touched on a really potent moment of Final Fantasy VIII that I've always quite loved, and a lot of people interpret it different ways, which is where Squall kind of freaks out a little bit at Seifer's perceived execution. So I definitely recommend people go and listen to that. So before we jump in today with the topic at hand, I'm always interested to know how people first arrived and discovered Final Fantasy. So I have a feeling that it was Final Fantasy VIII was the one that you first played.
Oh my god, how did you know? Yeah, Final Fantasy VIII was the first Final Fantasy game I ever played. I remember picking it up for the first time and watching the intro cutscene, and because obviously I played it much later than it was originally released, so I was seriously impressed by how well the intro cutscene had held up. But I remember just when the moment you can take over controlling Squall and you're in just the center, in front of that central kind of map console thing in Balam Garden. And I remember just running around this beautifully utopian sort of building and the beautiful music in the background. And I remember sitting there and thinking, oh God, I'm gonna love this game. There's a certain feeling, I think, that Final Fantasy VIII makes those of us who love the game feel. There's a sort of warmth, but also this kind of sadness, but this strange fascination with this world that is familiar and unfamiliar and has so many of these open-ended mysteries, and you're left at the end with this sort of I guess it just sort of appreciation for what you've seen, but also this desire to know what the hell happened here and what happened here and what was this and what was this. You know, you go back and you play it again and again for that. And yeah, that has stuck with me, and it was the reason I set up the channel. I would have all these these questions, and I would have all these things I wanted to talk about, and then I would kind of go, well, it's not that many people making Final Fantasy videos anymore.
I can relate to so much of what you've said. That firstly, with the content creation side of things, I very much started my YouTube journey with the same thing in mind. I mean, my very first videos I was discussing Tekken, which seems weird because they're fighting games, but that was like my warm-up because I wanted my magnum opus to be this big defense of Final Fantasy VIII at a time where nobody was really banging the drum for it, which, you know, kind of now fast forwarding, I'm glad to see kind of creators like yourself kind of join me in this fight to defend Final Fantasy VIII for eternity, which is great. And yeah, and as you say, you know, this kind of profound feeling that Final Fantasy VIII has. So for me, I discovered Final Fantasy VII first, which is a game that I love. I really appreciate it. But even just looking at that opening segment where in Final Fantasy VII you have Midgar, it's very doom and gloom, has these cyberpunk vibes to it. But then kind of flipping over to Final Fantasy VIII, you have this instant, as you say, kind of warmth and sadness. I think it has a certain nostalgia, But even in the moment where you're first playing it, like 25 years ago, it was instantly nostalgic. It's a very strange feeling that it has. It's like this kind of fantasy high school experience I never had, you know. So yeah, I can completely relate to those feelings there. Great. Okay, so move now into the topic of today, which is Final Fantasy VIII's secondary to tertiary NPCs. Now, this is a cast of characters I've always really enjoyed, and I think they stand quite distinct because they tend to recur quite a lot throughout the game. You know, they have their own little arcs, you know, a lot of them do. And I think this creates a certain intimacy about Final Fantasy VIII's world because we're seeing the same faces again and again as we play through the game. You know, recently on your channel, we discussed Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X together and how these games are quite similar. I think that's another kind of thread. And I think we might have touched on it lightly, but Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X are unique in how they have this recurring cast of NPCs. I don't know if you've kind of picked up on that.
No, I totally agree. And I agree with the comparison with Final Fantasy X as well. I think it does help, like you said, there's a familiarity there and there's an intimacy there with all of these non-player characters that you constantly see again and again and again, that not only add to the world building, but they become so familiar to you that you nearly feel like you're part of this gang and you're part of this adventure, because you're not just continuously meeting different people, or the background characters aren't just sort of bland one note and exist for a purpose and then they're never seen again. They build on that relationship, and so I think it adds to that kind of world building, that you're really part of this group of people, or that this world is very lived in, that you have just sort of landed in the middle of this pre-existing world because of how familiar and kind of how small the reoccurring cast of NPCs can get at a point in both of those games. I think particularly the NPCs in Balam Garden as well, I think it really builds that sort of boarding school atmosphere where it's the same faces and the same people you see again and again and again, even in cases like with poor Nita, who, despite having grown up with these people and gone to school with them and graduated with them, is so forgettable by most of the main cast of characters.
Yeah, I think of the sort of the student body in Balam, you're dead right. I think a few of them do recur. I think Nida is a big one. What's funny about him in particular, though, is obviously later on in the game, he's like, "Oh, do you remember me? We graduated together." And I actually didn't remember him at all. Like the name, like did you?
No, I didn't. And then when I played it back, and I saw the scene where Sid is, you know, congratulating each graduating Seed member, and he says something to Nita to the equivalent of, like, you know, sometimes it's okay if we just sort of blend into the background. That's all right. Don't worry about it, lad. And it's like, my God, his only character trait is that he's forgettable. God bless him, you know. I think it's a great kind of, it's one of those things that makes Final Fantasy VIII have great replay value. It's just little inside jokes like that you don't pick up the first time, because, like you said, when Nita's like, "Squall, dude, it's me," you're also like, we've never met, dude. What are you on about? And then you replay it and you go, "Oh, Jesus, he was to my right at that ceremony. Holy Christ," you know?
Yeah. And what a backhanded compliment from Sid as well.
Sid is so passive aggressive. And the first video I ever made really blew up was me really just letting loose on Sid and Adia Kramer. And I kind of made that point that, like, Sid's passiveness and his niceness often conceals something very nefarious at times, where he's very content to let certain things kind of exist in the student body, or certain attitudes exist, and he's very well able to accept a certain risk factor to everybody but himself, even if that means his largely teenage student body. And I always think of that scene where he's just like to Nita, "Yeah, well, you're not Squall, we don't need you for the prophecy, but like, just blend in and you'll be fine," you know? Yeah, and I think Nita, if he decided, well, all of a sudden he was taking up arms against the school, I think I would say, "You know what, Nita, like, you've been pushed to this point, you know what, that's fine. These kids owe you an apology."
Do you think him becoming captain, the helmsman on the bridge, was sort of just a concession?
So I have an insane theory about Nita.
Okay.
So I say Nida. How do you pronounce it? I just want to, because when people argue about this in the comment section, I want them to get clear sides on whose side they're on.
Okay, I've always said Nida.
You said Nida. Okay. Yeah. Well, I've always said it, but I'm often wrong. So that's also up for debate on how that's like super nice. I'm not going to argue my case at all. I could very much be wrong. I have had what I would describe as an insane delusion that Nida has this entire villain arc in Final Fantasy VIII because of the events of Final Fantasy VIII. I believe that we witness Nida becoming having like a turning point where he decides that he's all of a sudden at the end of this game going to become like a psychopath, and he very much like Anakin Skywalker. Like, I think Final Fantasy VIII is the Jedi Council rejecting Anakin. That is Nida's Anakin moment, deciding that, you know what, I am actually going to go over and I am going to join the dark side. Because you meet Nida at the very beginning of the game and you don't even remember him. And he has, if you have a choice of dialogue, and if you choose the negative line of dialogue, I think you tell him to like get out of the way, or you ignore him or something. He has this little line of dialogue where he's talking to himself and he's like, someday I'm going to rule this place. And then the reason that he ends up being the pilot for Balam Garden is because he goes to the Fisherman's Horizons guys who actually repaired and redid the Balam Garden school to become a school from the former kind of, there was flying contraptions, I think they were left over from the Central Empire, I think. And he goes to the Fisherman's Horizons technicians and asks to be taught how to pilot the ship. That's how he ends up as the pilot. He goes out of his own initiative and says, can you guys teach me? I'm going to be the pilot. So we know now that he has a desire for leadership. He's the only one able to pilot Balam Garden. And we also know that he is continuously pushed down, he's kicked around, nobody remembers him. The guy in charge is like, oh yeah, Nida, we graduated together, God, sorry, and then forgets his name again 10 minutes later in the next line of dialogue. I think we're witnessing the breakdown of a man into a villain, and I think at the end of Final Fantasy VIII, I think Nida just stages a coup, and I think Nida takes control of Balam Garden, and then Final Fantasy VIII.2 starts off with fighting off Nida's invasion of Balam Garden. And I think that's how he goes. I think he just descends into madness. But that's also an insane thing to think. So possibly I have descended into madness.
Well, what's funny is you've kind of, in a way, described Seifer's descent into villainy as well. He's like Seifer 2.0. Basically,
I think we're looking at the wrong guy. I think everybody's worried about Seifer this whole time. I think Seifer is the sane one out of the two. I think it's Nida. It's always the quiet ones you've got to watch.
I do agree. Nida is definitely overlooked, and it's kind of a comical recurrence that he is the sort of forgotten everyman, I suppose, of Balam Garden. I think not some. You can't really say the same for. I've always pronounced her name Zhu, but I think actually you'd pronounce it Shu. But yeah, Shu. I find her kind of interesting as well, because I was thinking about how the NPCs contribute in their own little ways, and she is a very small component of the Balam machine, but that's almost her purpose. She's like a constant. She is like the anchor. For example, in the beginning of the game, she's giving us mission briefings and bits like that on behalf of Headmaster Cid. But then after the Norg segment and Cid has stepped down, Norg and the faculty have gone away, it's like in any other circumstance that would be like anarchy, because you've just got a load of teenagers in a flying academy. So I feel like Zhu is that sort of kernel of responsibility and stuff that's sort of retained at Garden.
I agree. I think she's really the unappreciated backbone of the hierarchy in Balam Garden. Like, Squall, for as much as they've tried to prepare him for the leadership role, Squall does not want to do it. He's still very much thrust into it. And it is Shu who has to be his mentor after, like you said, Cid steps down and the faculty leave and they abandon these teenagers to a flying airship to their own devices. But Shu is sort of she takes on that role of like the older, more responsible kind of guide for Squall and kind of for everybody. She is always on top of everything. She's always, here's where we go next. You go to Shu for much of the game if you don't know what the next step is, and she'll say, oh, I think we're going here, I think we're doing this. She's sort of the model, she's nearly the model civil servant in a way. She is she's the backbone that if she didn't exist in the game, Squall couldn't do half of the things and wouldn't be able to go half of the places that they end up going, and they wouldn't have the organization that they have, because she's nearly almost like a personal assistant to Sid. She operates the first half of the game, and I think that gives her this sort of excellent training, not only on top of her military training, which she seems very, very good at, to keep everything in line, keep the people who are supposed to be in charge in line. She's this constant presence, like you said. And yeah, I think very underappreciated. But again, I think without her, much of the machinery in Balam Garden would not work. I think Squall would be running around like a chicken without a head. And I think that she is so needed there to keep people together, because she's so constant and so grounded that she calms a lot of it down.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And you've touched on something that is so, I think, key to why certain NPCs are elevated in Final Fantasy VIII, which is Squall, because we have quite famously a very stoic, reserved protagonist who doesn't kind of open up to anyone. All of our understanding, or most of our understanding of Squall early on, comes through his internal monologues when he's lying on his bed in Balam, for example. So I think, on the one hand, sort of provoke him out of it, but also in some senses to sort of make up for the deficit that Squall leaves. So, for example, in the leadership of Balam and that transition period, we have characters like Shu who fill that in. So, and I think we can find that a lot in the game. Zone and Watts and a couple of these other NPCs that we may well come to, I think they exist in small part to sort of bounce off Squall. His frustrations with characters is part of his character development, and bits like that. So just I suppose we can move on from Balam shortly, but I did want to touch on Sid, because you mentioned him already and your frustrations with him, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I think I've heard you say in the past that you have your beef with Sid and Adia. I find Sid really interesting as an NPC because he does have this subtle arc. I remember when we're first introduced to him, he's briefing us in for the Dole mission, and he's wearing this red waistcoat and stuff, and he has this very composed, almost fatherly formality. He does this mission briefing, and he seems really, it's like, this is the guy we're trying to impress, we want to get good grades and all of this sort of thing. But then he undergoes this transformation where he devolves into this sort of, we just start seeing the flaws in his character, kind of patheticness, if you like. He's done this deal with Norg, who is obviously a very sort of underhanded guy. We see that he's in hoc to this garden faculty, who right from the outset, these characters are obviously very dubious. I mean, they're a bit freaky, really, the garden faculty. I remember as a kid, they were instantly sort of a bit villainous. And then we learn that Sid has made this deal with the devil, and he's actually not quite this strong leadership figure we expected. So, yeah, it was interesting to see his arc take place. A lot of people don't like the Norg segment. I think it's actually quite important because it creates this transition between Sid and Squall in a way, because it's all revealed about how this deal was done and things like that. So I think, seeing Sid being pushed around like literally and stuff, I think it's quite an important transitional moment.
Yeah, my thing with that Norg section, and I agree, I actually think it's a really crucial character development section more than anything. I think that Squall and Sid relationship is, it's forever changed by the reveal of Sid's general sort of weakness, that he's like, there is an element of, and I would agree, there's a sort of patheticness about him. There's a sort of passiveness that is so passive that it's almost malicious, in my view, that he is so willing to outsource any of the dirty work out of fear, that he's willing to place the burden of that responsibility on children, on the students. And many of these students were his foster children. So these children are with him from the time that they are 5 and 6 years old, like we see with Squall and the gang, the Squang, in the orphanage scenes. I mean, they have nowhere else to go except under the guardianship of Sid, and it breeds this sort of relationship with Sid where they are sort of they see him as being on this pedestal. He's a father figure, but he's also a mentor. He's a saint nearly. And I always find it so heartbreaking in that scene where Irvine reveals to the gang basically, hey, we were all in this orphanage together and we actually all know each other. And they are piecing together their relationship between their memory loss and the use of the Guardian forces. And Quistis has this moment where she's like, well, Sid mustn't have known. He would never have allowed us to do that. He wouldn't have put us through that. And they simultaneously have to work back from the fact that this parental figure and mentor and teacher who, like you mentioned, when we start the game, there is an element of we're trying to impress this lovely man. He is almost like Robin Williams in the Dead Poet Society. He's, he's the cool teacher. He cares about you. He wants the best for you. And then they have to piece together the fact that this man has sold out the school and has made them sort of mercenaries for hire, for profit, that he abandoned them because he was afraid to deal with battle while training these children to battle. He had no problem with them putting their lives on the line and being hired mercenaries for cash to keep this whole thing going, but he himself did not want to be caught in the throes of battle, and that he was willing for them to have all of their memories erased to fight with the Guardian forces, even though we know from the Final Fantasy VIII Ultimania that there is public pressure among the general public to not use the Guardian forces because people are protesting against them. And we know that Balam is the only school, at least that we can see, where the Guardian forces are used. We don't know anything about Trabia, but we know that Selphie accidentally encounters a Guardian force, and that's how she loses her memories, and Galbadia Garden doesn't. So Sid has this, that the Noric section and everything after that, I think, is Squall and everybody else taking down Sid off of a pedestal and seeing this man not as a father figure, not as their principal, not as their mentor, but as a deeply, deeply flawed man who has really gotten in over his head and out of cowardice has abandoned the responsibility to them. No adult is coming to save them here. They are going to have to be the adults, and they're going to have to save themselves because the faculty have abandoned them largely, and Sid has abandoned them. And it's almost like a tragic coming of age. It's not like a fun coming of age story. It's none of these adults have our best interests at heart, and they're not coming to save us. So we have to grow up quick and get this sorted.
No, that's a really good observation, because I think for myself, I've always, so for example, with the Guardian Force side of things, I've always looked at things like, well, we learn in the game that actually Norg, and, with the faculty basically doing his bidding, is sort of pulling the strings for the most part. And they're probably the ones that are advocating for this Guardian Force, because they don't care about the students. They're just pushing for profit. They're doing all of these campaigns. The opening Dole mission is a great example, because they just pull out because they weren't paid enough. And they're like, so that's a classic sort of Norg maneuver. But I think you're dead right. I've always looked at it where these guys are sort of pulling the strings, and Sid is this sort of sympathetic guy who's just the face of everything, and he's made this bad deal. But you're dead right. It's like, where do you draw the line? Because he hasn't really stood up and said, this will not stand. He's kind of letting these things happen,
And I think that's what, I think you feel that way because that is how Squall feels. Squall is like, no, Sid is the sympathetic one. It's Norg, and it's these, it's the faculty staff, they are the bad guys. I totally agree. I absolutely think that Norg is the one that was pushing for the use of the Guardian Forces. And I actually think the geopolitical and the social implications of the Dole mission at the beginning are a near perfect example of showing and not telling in a video game about the world. It's in an excellent bit of world building, that there's a world that these countries are in conflict. There is sort of this colonial attempt to take over this country for resources or for their own gain, and then when it becomes a matter of finances, they didn't pay us enough to save your lives. Well, actually, we will back out of this because the only concern is money. And I definitely think that is Norg's idea. But like you said, Sid is the one responsible for these children because Sid founded the garden, and Sid was their foster parent. And only very late in the game, when it is much, much, much too late, does Sid all of a sudden decide to have this moment of confrontation against Norg. And then Norg, with his giant paddle hands, literally backhands the man out of the room. And he's totally ineffective. It's much too late. And that's, Cid's kind of cowardice there, that it comes much too late.
You mentioned, well, we've touched on the Dole mission there, and you mentioned the geopolitical events. So it's okay. I don't know if you wanted to discuss anyone else in Balan, but I was going to shift over and discuss Galbadia now.
Fire on.
Because on the Dole mission, we're introduced to a pair of my favourite comical villains across the series, which is Biggs and Wedge. Of course, Biggs and Wedge are like character names, character types that recur across the Final Fantasy series. They're a kind of staple of the Katase games, I think. He was the one that introduced them as a big nod to Star Wars. But whenever people mention Biggs and Wedge from Final Fantasy, they're the two I think of, the two Galbadian soldiers. And I find them really amusing, but I think they also sort of serve a purpose. They sort of, the Galbadians are introduced to us off the bat as the villains, but they offer a slightly different perspective to it, where they are not ideologically driven villains. They're not like the biggest fans of Vinza de Ling. They're sort of like the everyman of like the Galbadian machine. They're just trying to make ends meet. They have this job that they eventually decide isn't worth doing anymore. So I think they kind of just furnish us with a slightly more softer, more comical perspective on the villains that we're actually dealing with.
I agree, and I love the bit where you go into the Laguna dream sequence, and you're in the bar before you meet Julia. And apparently somebody discovered that in the code, the two army men that you talk to who were like, oh, I'd love to talk to Julia, she's so pretty. That is Biggs and Wedge. So I love that you have that moment with them as Laguna as well, where they're just sitting in the bar going, oh, Julia's so pretty. Because it's just so, again, like you were saying, it's so human that like Laguna, they're not mad about this conflict. They're not mad about who they're fighting for. They're certainly not fighting in his honor, that they are just exhausted foot soldiers just doing a job, like you said. They need to get paid. It's grunt work. They don't particularly support the ideology, but they that they have these human moments where, like Laguna, a man where we really do sympathize with and like, that they're on the same wavelength ideologically as him, that this is just a job, this is not a lifestyle. And like you said, they eventually decide, what, it's not worth it, we're not getting paid enough to deal with this, and back out.
Yeah, that's it. It's this almost sort of Scooby-Doo villain thing where it's like these meddlesome kids. It's kind of amusing when you look at it in those terms, because particularly that's a great factoid about the Laguna dream. It really makes it, I wish they sort of just put the name captions in there, because that would have been a great connection. But particularly if they're of a similar vintage to Laguna, you can imagine how just demeaning it would be to get your butt handed to you by a bunch of 17-year-olds constantly.
I had never put that together until you said it. They would have to be of the same age as Laguna, and they got their ass kicked by a 17-year-old. Like, a group of school children have come in to these sort of career soldiers, and they've just knocked them out one by one.
Yeah.
God, yeah, I can certainly see why that would have been maybe the turning point for them deciding, you know what, this is not worth it. This is getting too much.
Yeah. I think it's and it's just so redemptive as well, and I think it's a sort of testament to, I suppose, Final Fantasy VIII in how it didn't arbitrarily kill them off. It wasn't like, oh, this final boss fight just to finish off Biggs and Wedge. It was like, no, we're going to give them a sort of comical, optimistic send-off where kind of Biggs decides to throw in the towel and quit the military, and Wedge just wantonly follows him because why not?
It does sort of remind me a little bit of like the end of like a 90s Pokemon episode where Jesse and James and Meowth would get booted off into the sky, but they'd be ready to come back another day. It's like a soft exit, kind of to indicate these guys aren't really that bad. These are certainly not the worst people that you'll meet in game. These are really quite silly people that you should be wasting your energy kind of hating, Maybe that paves the way for the sequel. It should be a Biggs and Wedge game. That's what I'm saying.
The Adventures of Biggs and Wedge. I would pay for that DLC.
But you know what? So would I if Square, decided all of a sudden that they had money to spare. And we're like, you know what? We are going to touch Final Fantasy VIII for the first time in nearly 30 years. Yeah, I would too.
Yeah. But yeah, so that leads me on actually to my next, because I mentioned the odd couple earlier, and I think there's a bunch of these. Again, I think it's a bit of a Kataseism. He likes presenting sort of, I suppose, when I say odd couple, you see it a lot in like television comedy and stuff, but and movies, but it's kind of two characters that are sort of pushed to, that they are operating in the same environment, but they're kind of contrasted, and they're together for whatever reason, and that's where the source of comedy comes from, this friction between them. So I suppose we can see the sort of hierarchy and the personalities of Biggs and Wedge. But it leads me on to Raijin and Fujin, because like you say, with the soft exit and the familiarity and the warmth, I think there's really something about Raijin and Fujin that show that too, because they are sort of, they're villains in the game insofar as they are a sort of boss fight for us at numerous stages and stuff. They're in hock with Seifer, but at the same time there's a sort of familiarity between the Squang and Raijin and Fujin, because they are classmates, and that is acknowledged through the game as well when they bump into one another.
I'm so fond of Raijin and Fujin. I think they're great. I think that they are such excellent like narrative foils for Seifer. I think one of the last times we see them in the game, where they come up to Seifer and say, you have gone too far with this, and we have promised to follow you everywhere, but we cannot follow you here. That is, to me, one of the best moments in the game, that these two people who are devoted to Seifer, even they cannot condone how far he has gone, and they're unwilling to cross their own moral lines any further, that this is how far Seifer has sunk, and this is how at this point of the game sort of irredeemable he is, and how desperate he is in need of somebody bigger to kind of come along and put him in his place, that even his beloved friends are like, we have fought people for you, we have stood by you, but we cannot stand with you here. But I think you're right in that them being classmates, it adds an interesting element to the relationship between the main characters, because often like the villain sidekicks, they're quite like, they're like the goons, they're like kind of pathetic, they're easily beaten, and they're disposable, and they're laughed at, or they're sort of they're one note evil. But I often found that the moment after the gang realizes that Seifer has been quote unquote executed, and Squall has his sort of outburst moment, the scene directly after that is that Squall runs out into the halls of Galbadia Garden, and he runs into Raijin and Fujin, and he has to break the chain of them. They're executed, and they're like, no, he hasn't. No, Seifer can't die. He doesn't die. That's not a thing. Good luck though. We'll see ya. You mind yourself. We're gonna go look for him, because there's no way he's dead. And it's a really human moment for sort of like a villain sidekick, where it's just Squall telling these classmates that he really doesn't have any beef with. Like, Squall doesn't have a problem with Raijin and Fujin. If Raijin and Fujin weren't attacking him on the orders of Seifer, on the orders of Ultimecia, Squall wouldn't have a problem with them. There's an element of, well, I always picked up that there was an element of fondness from Squall. Squall doesn't dislike these two. He quite likes them. There's no animosity there, really. There's just sort of a sense of annoyance that he has to fight them, or that they keep insisting on kind of getting in the way. But that scene where he has to tell them that Seifer has died, they're like, no, that's not, no. Anyway, good luck. It's a very human scene that humanizes, I think, Squall, and it humanizes Raijin and Fujin as well. That it's just like, oh, these are three classmates. This isn't like the good guy and the villains. This is just three classmates, and they're drawing their own lines in the sand here. Raijin and Fujin, we don't even believe he's dead. He is our leader. We're going to follow him everywhere.
Yeah.
And then Squall having to go then his own.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that's a great moment. And conversely, I wouldn't even call them grey characters to that, because, for example, in Final Fantasy VII, we have recurring interactions with the Turks, who are sort of, they're sort of paid goons, but they're interesting. They have great personalities and stuff. But there is a clear, like, you're good guys and we're sort of ambivalent grey villains, and that they do have that element of villainy. I wouldn't even go so far as to say Raijin and Fujin are sort of grey characters. I think they are fundamentally like good-natured characters, but as you say, their allegiance to Seifer just sort of trumps everything. Another important thing that leads up to how important that moment is, you mentioned, where they finally turn away from Seifer and sort of reject him, is in these instances, they are the only thing that really furnish us with any ideas about Seifer. And again, we touched on Seifer in the episode we did together, and how, you know, he's built up really strongly in the first disc or so, and then he sort of falls off a bit. But I really like how in his absence, sort of Raijin and Fjin, they just subtly, in these subtle kind of statements and dialogues that they have, sort of nod to what sort of character he is. So for example, with Raijin just having that assurance, like there's no way that Seifer is dead, there's no way he would put up with a trial, I think he says as well. It's like, it just really gives us an insight to what sort of person Seifer's like, even in his absence.
And I think that they're so crucial to Seifer not being viewed as like a black and white villain character. Like, I think they really, really humanize Seifer, because their devotion to him consistently, it almost makes us as a player wonder, like, well, what is it about Seifer that they just love so much that they're willing to follow him? And, you know, for all of his bravado, he must have some sort of a heart, and he must have some element of like friendship, or he must have some capacity for care, because these two people, particularly together, like the force that they are together, they're both so different, and yet both of them have this allegiance to Seifer. And it builds off what we hear Rinoa say as well in that Galbadia scene, funnily enough, where she says, you know, he used to come and help us of his own free will, try to free Timber from colonization, and he would make you feel like you could do anything. Like, I think it's Raijin and Fjin's consistent allegiance to him throughout the game that is a very humanizing line for Seifer, that he must have some element of compassion and friendship to these people, because even at the end of the game, when he is, you know, like the scene that we were mentioning, where he's totally kind of lost to his ideals, he's totally lost to the cause, and Raijin and Fjin say, this is enough, this is not who you are, we are going. He can't bring himself to punish them for it. He can't lash out at them. He will lash out at Squall, he will take Rinoa hostage, but he lets Raijin and Fjin go, even as he's in kind of a heightened state where he's almost a little bit manic with panic, and that this is all kind of collapsing in on him. He just lets them go, and you can kind of feel a sadness from him, but he is so determined to see this through that he is willing to sacrifice them. And I think that even at the end is a moment for Seifer that keeps him from being a totally evil villain or an evil boss, that even at the end he can't bring himself to hurt these two people.
Yeah, and particularly in that moment as well, because as you say, there's such desperation there. I always remember the line where it's just like, I think Squall confronts him and he's like, how can you call yourself a sorceress's knight, or something like that, I'm paraphrasing, and he's like, oh, I consider myself a young revolutionary now, and he's sort of wearing these different hats, and he's trying to sort of justify these unjustifiable actions. And even despite that, he's in this end game, he's got his lovely coat's been completely like wrecked and all of that sort of visual metaphoring and stuff. I think, yeah, it's really prudent that you note that he, even in that state, wouldn't bring himself to hurt these two. Another thing that I hadn't really considered until you mentioned it is the Rinoa fling or whatever that's alluded to with Seifer, and you know, she's obviously met him previously, whatever sort of context that was. Without Raijin and Fjin being this additional furnishing of Seifer actually not being a bad guy, I feel like that Rinoa perception of Seifer would be completely out of left field. It just wouldn't work, because it'd be like, well, what's that based on and stuff. But because you also have Raijin and Fjin who are sort of banging the drum for Seifer, it's like, well, Rinoa and Raijin and Fjin can't both be wrong. You know, there must be this other dimension to Seifer that we simply don't see.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it would have. I think without Raijin and Fjin there, it would have that perception of Seifer that Rinoa has, I think it wouldn't have been taken seriously, because I think it would have been like, it would have added to this sort of fake love triangle thing that they try to do, certainly in the English translation anyway, where they It would have been just perceived that, oh, Rinoa's crush on Seifer, Rinoa fancying Seifer, she has heightened this guy in her head as being this much nicer person than he actually is. But like you said, because we see Raijin and Fujin and their interactions with him, it's like, oh, okay, this guy almost on his own must be much better than we see him when he is performing this bravado at the seed exams or in front of somebody that he considers sort of a personal rival or a personal threat. Like there must be something under the surface there, because we've seen 3 people, and 2 of whom have no romantic relation with him, have this opinion of him. So I think if it was just Rinoa, like you were saying, I don't even think it would have been taken seriously. I think people would have just kind of dismissed it on hand, and it wouldn't have lent anything.
So, noting Rinoa there, I want to shift now on to a couple of characters, because it's interesting to see how the game is sort of structured, and how these sort of NPCs and various secondary characters build up impressions and world build for certain characters over others. What I mean by that is most of the guys we've discussed so far are inhabitants of Balam Garden. They very much inform the childhoods, the experiences, the sort of growing up of Squall, exclusive of Rinoa. And I know you've touched on this before, and it's apparent in the game during the basketball sequence. Rinoa is sort of an exclusionary figure, I suppose, from that sort of garden student body. So there's a few characters I'd like to touch on. Zone and Watts, I think in sort of small ways, they sort of inform her character a little bit. And also General Caraway. And I think General Caraway is actually a fascinating character. I've always liked him, but it was only when discussing Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VIII with you last time, I actually started thinking a bit more about General Caraway. And I was like, wow, I think the purpose he serves is really his presence and the way we see him and his relationship with Rinoa. It sort of almost mirrors Squall in some ways. I realised in our conversation that both Squall and Rinoa are absent a mother. They have an estranged relationship with a father figure. And that extends to things like Squall taking his mother's surname, and then Rinoa seems like it heartily is obviously Julia's surname. So they're sort of distancing themselves from the father figure. Obviously, we see Caraway and Rinoa interacting with one another, and we can see that volatility there. So yeah, I find it quite interesting. I don't know if you have particular thoughts on Caraway. I know you are like the premier defender of Rinoa, and he is a part of her life. So
yeah, well, I agree. I think Caraway is a really fascinating character, but I actually think the thing that makes Caraway and his relationship with Rinoa really interesting is the changing views that other people, so like Squall and Quistis and Selfie and Zell, the changing views that they have of both Rinoa and Caraway through finding out that they are related to each other. It has all been, I made a video on this as well because I could go on forever, but it always kind of bothers me when I see people interpret the relationship between Rinoa and Caraway as Rinoa being superficial and childish and silly, and Caraway's heavy-handedness being necessary to curb her being so silly and dumb and da 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 da. I don't think the audience takes as seriously the steps Rinoa takes to distance herself from her father and what that means if you look at that critically, not even from a position of liking Rinoa, but even just from a position of complete neutrality and not assuming the worst of Rinoa. That in what circumstances must a very very wealthy girl who grows up in this mansion in the center of the city, in what circumstances would a very wealthy girl, the only child, not only leave that comfort, leave that wealthy life, essentially go no contact with her very powerful military father, change her surname to her mother's maiden name, and then in the scenes where the entire party are together with Caraway, tell the rest of the party, please do not leave me here with him. And it's just irritating to constantly see again and again going, well, Caraway, Rinoa's so silly. She's of no use to the gang. Like, okay, but just take off your hating Rinoa hat for just 2 seconds and just think critically about what it would mean for any other character if all of those things occurred like if they had done all of those things to distance themselves from a parent, what would you think of that parent? Whatever you think of Rinoa, if you think she's silly and frivolous and she can't be taken seriously and she cries and blah, 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 Caraway's relationship with Rinoa and how that impacts other people's opinions of the two of them is so interesting. And it even occurs in the game where they're really annoyed at Rinoa that she wouldn't tell them that he knows her. And they're kind of thinking, why has Rinoa, Zell says something like, now we're stuck in the middle of some sort of father-daughter dispute. For God's sake, like Rinoa has dragged us into some sort of petty little battle with her father. And Caraway initially comes across as very calm and reserved, and he's the competent, capable one, and Rinoa's, she's not, she's throwing a tantrum or whatever. And then by the end of that scene, Squall, I don't know, I can't remember if it's before or after Rinoa tells Squall, since I've given you this contract and I'm technically your boss, I'm giving you an order, do not leave me here. And when Caraway makes some sort of comment to Squall, well, obviously you're not going to get my daughter involved in this. And Squall's like, well, actually, what if I do? Because I'll fight. Are you going to fight? And I think that moment is when the gang realized maybe Rinoa wasn't entirely being this frivolous, silly, spoiled runaway, that actually perhaps there is another side to that relationship. Because when I think Squall sees that shift first, because they're having that one-on-one conversation, and really puts it to Caraway that like, I'm actually going to protect her and we're taking her. And then I think takes that fraught relationship seriously between the two of them.
That's a really good point. And I think Caraway, he's a very sort of he's like a general in the Galbadian military. He's emotionally removed, patriarchal sort of mindset. He is like the patriarch of the household and whatnot, used to getting his own way. So it's really interesting, as you say, when Squall just turns around and is like, yeah, it's not going to go that way for you.
You're not winning this one, buddy. Step down.
Yeah. No, it's great. So I did find, and Caraway, he's an example of one of these characters, although, as I say, a lot of these characters recur. Caraway only appears that one time for the assassination scenario, but I think it furnishes us with such an impression of Rinoa, and as you've kind of elaborated on here, like her backstory and what's going on with her, I think it was a really insightful moment into that for a character that wasn't originally part of the Garden troupe. Yeah, I think I have a similar thing with Zone and Watts. I was talking about the odd couple, and I touched on the similarities between Squall and Rinoa in terms of like the parentage. But what I like is that where Seifer has Raijin and Fjin, sort of Rinoa has like Zone and Watts, and it's almost like she has her own little trifecta of people that would sort of lay down in the street for her, just like Seifer does. And I really like that. And I think although they appear quite sparingly, though they are recurring, I think they show, although Rinoa is not from this contingent of Garden students that grew up together and sort of have one another's backs, even as we've touched on, like Squall and Raijin, there's a certain warmth between them. Rinoa does have these people that will go to bat for her, and I love this interaction with Zone and Watts on the White Seed ship, kind of later on in the game, where Zone is kind of famously like this coward. It's like on the Timber mission, it's like people need to go in and confront Vinza Deling, and then he's like, oh, I have a stomach cramp, and he like kills over. He's like, I can't possibly go. So he's like a coward, and he's enamored with Seed, these sort of powerful guys. But then when Rinoa goes into her coma, we sort of speak to Zone on the White Seed ship, and he's like, you son of a bitch. He's like, he will actually shout at Squall. He's like, what's happened to Rinoa? You were responsible. So I really like how there's a certain accountability to Squall in Zone, in particular, Zone and Watts, and these guys that are around Rinoa.
I love Zone and Watts. I really, really do. And I remember the first time I played Final Fantasy VIII, one of my gripes was that Rinoa doesn't go back with them, or that they don't, there's not more of a presence with them, because they really were some of the only people, certainly for the first half of the game, who, like you said, had Rinoa's back. Like they were really the three of them, they were so fond of Rinoa. And in the same way that I think Raijin and Fjin humanize Seifer, I think Zone and Watts legitimize Rinoa as this sort of capable revolutionary, that she, like you said, belongs in this world. it's not like a passing fad for her so much, because she has these very deep relationships with Zone and Watts and with the rest of the people in Timber. They all know her by name. They're all very fond of her. And it's an indicator that actually Rinoa has built very deep ties in Timber. But like you were saying, like Zone and Watts being non-fighters, that will say, like, one is an information gatherer and one has situational IBS and just can't bring himself to get kind of physical in a mission. I think they do make Rinoa a sort of de facto leader. They make her look, by contrast, very competent, very very devoted to the cause, and I think it really confirms and really sells the idea of Rinoa as being more than just like flighty and silly. And I think I think it's to the detriment of Rinoa's character that they don't meet her again, that they don't reoccur again, because in contrast to Seed, Rinoa doesn't really match up because she doesn't have that formal military training. Whereas in comparison to Zone and Watts, she is more on an equal level because they are these sort of amateur revolutionaries, and they like Raijin and Fujin with Seifer, they back up her devotion to the cause. They're kind of the proof of her legitimacy in what she's doing. I often thought about how, like you were mentioning, that like they're so enamored with Seed, and that how that would maybe relate to their relationship with their fathers, and how both of them as children, which we find out very early on in the game. We ask one of the other owls on the train, and we find out that Zone and Watts saw their fathers shot dead by the Galbadian military for their part in setting up sort of this their own version of a revolutionary organization, that it has been left to Zone and Watts then to carry that on, and they're doing it sort of in the honor of their fathers. And I often wondered if that sort of that enamorment with Seed was because they saw that sort of competence, that military competence that maybe they saw their fathers have, that they themselves don't feel like they have, because they never had the experience sort of revolutionary to teach them how to carry this on. They really are flying blind. Are we maybe trained when we play the game to see them as kind of silly characters because Squall is so fed up with their amateurness, and he's tapping his watch and he's saying, why are you making me wait out here? Why are you making me run errands for you? I'm a big military boy. I shouldn't be doing this. But that moment of hearing their backstory reaffirms then that they do take this seriously. Whereas Squall and Quistis and Selfie and Zell, they can go home after this is done, because this is just a mission for them, that this is actually, for Zone and Watts, this is their lives, this is their country, this is their people, for as amateur as it is. But I think both of them are great characters, and I love that scene on the White Seed ship where I remember being really taken aback that he's like, you son of a bitch.
Yeah.
But where he says, you were responsible for her. We left her in your hands because we thought that you would take care of her, because you were these trained professionals, and now look. Again, I'm always raging that they didn't meet up with her at the end. I just would have loved even that CG scene at the end of the credits where they're all in Balamgarden. I would have loved to see Zone and Watts there with her, because they're a really nice example of they're a very platonic trio. Like, even though Rinoa is like the princess on the train and she has this little girly princessy room, I never got the sense from the two of them that like they have a crush on her, they fancy her. It seems very sisterly, like they adore her and they're very fond of her, and they're very protective of her, because they see her in this sort of sisterly way. And I think it's nice that they don't kind of play into that idea of, well, they could only care for her so much if they liked her romantically.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'd never thought about that, but I think that really lends to why we like them so much, because there's no there's no underlying motives there, which is really sweet. And actually, it's kind of funny, you talk about this sort of a sibling vibe they have. It's like obviously there's the little, it's not even a quest, it's just you can find the Girl Next Door magazine at the Timber Maniac's place and give it to Zone. So he's not a plant, he is very much into the girls, but it's not Rinoa. And I think it might be Rinoa that's like, oh yeah, Zone, he's really into naughty magazine. Yeah, they have that sort of transparency with one another, which is really as you say, it's more of a sibling thing than than anything else. So that's really sweet as well.
And actually, my favorite NPC in Timber, for personal reasons, isn't actually Zoner Watts. It's the guy in the editor of the newspaper that you go in to speak to as Squall, and he talks for so long that Squall blacks out and comes to an hour later and is like, what just happened? Why is he still talking? And Squall is nearly has a scientific bewilderment that this man who talked for so long uninterrupted without breath about something Squall does not care about at all. He fascinates me because I used to work in print journalism, and I met many a man like that, and so I used to laugh my head off when I would play that scene, because I would say, "Yep, absolutely, that's absolutely on brand."
Yeah, you know, the only time, I mean, I'm not really on Twitter anymore, but the only time I ever approached gaining traction on Twitter is, I think I wrote something is like, growing up is thinking you're Squall Leonhardt and then waking up one day and realizing you're the editor of Timber Maniacs, just moaning about youth and you know, life being wasted on the young and whatever. And then you've got Squall, like, what is this guy talking about? Yeah, I really find that funny as well. And as I say, you know, there's very rarely a character wasted. You know, there's very rarely a bit of dialogue wasted. And I think that guy really, obviously it leans to the idea that, unlike most Final Fantasies, we are playing as high school students, basically, and this guy's just moaning about it. He's this curmudgeonly, he's probably only 30, because you know what Square are like. Like, if you're 30, you're geriatric. But so I've only got you know, there's a bunch of NPCs in Final Fantasy VIII. I've only got a couple more on my list to skirt around. One that's always interested me is Mayor Dobe. Do you pronounce it Dobe? I don't know if there's another way.
I pronounce it Dobe.
Dobe. Okay.
So far, we're 3 for 3 on names that we both pronounce differently.
Yeah. Okay. So Mayor Dobe. I mean, I suppose you have Adobe, the software.
I think that's why. I think that's why I call him that. I don't think it's anything more complicated than that.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm quite interested in him is it's almost philosophical with Mayor Dobe, because he is this ardent pacifist and non-violent, non-interventionist in an inherently chaotic and non-pacifistic world. And although we can look at him as certainly like a aggravating character, you know, he kind of, you know, we look at most of the game through Squall's perspective, and he's just quite blunt with us, and he's like, when can you leave, basically. So, you know, the player doesn't particularly warm up to him in most cases, but looking at it beyond that, I think he is quite interesting in how he tries this non-intervention approach with people that simply aren't having it, and they want to burn his town to the ground, you know.
I think it's, whenever I think of Mayor Dobe / Dobe in Fisherman's Horizon, I always think of that that quote by the author Arundhati Roy, where she talks about peaceful protest being inherently a form of political theatre, and political theatre requires an audience. But what do you do if you have no audience? Political theatre, and therefore pacifism and peaceful protest, are inherently useless and will not resolve any sort of conflict with a person or a country or an institution that is intent on steamrolling you or destroying you. And I think the mayor really is a great example of that sort of quote, that we can, and it's interesting because, like you said, we're supposed to find him aggravating, but I don't necessarily think we're supposed to find him unsympathetic, because I think Squall really does have a sort of almost pitying sympathy for him, where he says something like, yeah, like, I get why you would like for it to be peaceful. I too would love to be living in a peaceful world where peaceful protest was possible, but this is a genocidal colonizing military, and your peaceful protest means nothing to them because they want you dead, and the only language they understand is physical violence. So I kind of got the sense that Squall, because Squall actually intervenes, Irvine says something like, you know, you're kind of being a dick here, like, hang on, we're trying to help you. And Squall actually intervenes and says, no, leave him alone. He wants to leave and we'll leave. So I kind of feel like Squall, and therefore the kind of narrative voice in the game, is telling us, yes, you're supposed to think these people aren't necessarily doing the right thing by, sticking so rigidly to pacifism in all, being so black and white about pacifism, but that ultimately it's an incredibly sympathetic belief to have. And it's not something wrong necessarily, and it's not a bad belief to have, but it's just that they don't live in a world where that is a sustainable solution to conflict, because the conflict is so rooted in these sort of nefarious systems and institutions that just see your peaceful protest or your pacifism as a great excuse to steamroll you. And I think Dobe ends up at the end of the invasion of Fisherman's Horizon having to sit with that, and having to sit with the fact that the only reason that he and his people are alive was because somebody physically intervened. And I think he will have to sit with that for a very long time afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such a it's an interesting little scene, just that moment. And I think it's optional. We don't necessarily have to speak with him, I don't think. But he's just sat there kind of destitute on his own. You can see, like, his entire worldview has been shattered before him. And as you say, that's where Squall has that little moment with him where he says, I'd love to have this idealistic worldview as well. I see where you're coming from, but it just doesn't work that way. So yeah, that's a great moment. It's also, I think, as I say, I rarely think a character or scenario is wasted in Final Fantasy VIII. I think that also helps as a building block towards Squall's path to leadership as well, because it's a very diplomatic and sobering and, I suppose, mature conversation that he has with Mayor Dobe,
And I think it's really, there's a recurring theme in Final Fantasy VIII of, we kind of touched on it briefly before, of like the new generation of young people in this world counteracting the beliefs of the adults, of like showing up the adults and their beliefs. Like Squall is 17 and he has had to sort of sit this grown man down and say, like, listen, idealism is great in an ideal world, but it just isn't working here, and we have to be very practical. And Squall has to be, like you were saying, the mature adult in that conversation, and Squall has to have the nuance in that conversation, in the same way that he has to have the sort of responsibility when Sid vacates it, and he has to he has to not mind, but he has to really parent or reparent this other generation of adults in this world who were on the front lines of the last war. And like you were saying, like, Squall is developing his leadership capabilities, but I think he's also developing his own personal beliefs. And I think the generation of young people with him, as they go through the second bout of conflict, are nearly counteracting sort of solid beliefs that were set in stone after the First World War. Nearly, it's sort of meant to be paralleling to the First World War. And I think that's so interesting that it's Squall as the 17-year-old who is continuously having these conversations with the adults, and often the adult NPCs, much like we were saying, the editor of the Timbermaniacs, who goes on about how youth is wasted and the young aren't grateful and da. It's Squall having to, and the others like him, having to reevaluate their new belief system in this new world that they are still fighting through. I think it's such an interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a great point on the First World War. And as you were mentioning it, it made me think as well. I mean, this game would have been written and developed and released in the midst of what I think is called the Lost Generation in Japan. So it was like, obviously they were like the biggest economy in the world up until the 1980s. Then it sort of fell off a cliff and they're barely recovering now. So you have this lost generation of youth that I think, kind of looking at real world historical parallels to Final Fantasy VIII's release, that was going on as well. But it's really interesting because you've mentioned this about Dobe. We see him with the shattered worldview. We've seen Vinza Deling, another older generation, his own hubris has destroyed him. We've discussed Sid Kramer, whose ill decision making has sort of unmade him and had Squall take his place. And we also see characters like Martine, a very subtle character who was the former headmaster of Galbadia. We see him with a shattered worldview at Fisherman's Horizon as well, don't we? There is this transitional phase between young and old in Final Fantasy VIII going on in the background.
Yeah, and Martine is so interesting because I think it's interesting that he's even taken into Fisherman's Horizon in the first place, because by all means he himself was one of the faces of the sort of militarism in Galbadia. Like, he was the principal of Galbadia Garden, which was the school that had the strongest links with the Galbadian military and the Galbadian government. And I think it's interesting that he's even allowed in Fisherman's Horizon, as long as he has sort of nearly in a sort of pseudo Christian sense, he has confessed his sins, he has denounced his old life, and he is now allowed to enter Fisherman's Horizon. But that he now, like, where does he go from here? And the last time we see him, like you said, he's just a very despondent man who has been left with no other choice but to choose this sort of pacifist island, and he has no identity anymore outside of that. So yeah, he's an interesting one for sure, because I remember seeing him there the first time playing the game and thinking that it was an interesting choice that that's where he ended up, because he doesn't seem a man all so remorseful when we meet him, and he sends us off necessarily kind of to our death at Galbadia Garden. So there's kind of, I feel like, maybe missing gaps in Martine's story, because I feel like it's like a big jump, but ultimately I do think it is interesting that he ends up there and has to kind of piece his life back together again after trying to sell out Squall and the gang for the government and for the military.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, another character that I would have loved to see some of the gaps filled in there, because there's, like a lot of characters in Final Fantasy VIII, there's just enough to hook you in and make him intriguing. We see him in two scenes: the briefing at Galbadia, and then him, a broken man. Starting to wrap up now. I didn't really have other characters to discuss. I suppose finally the last character that kind of stood out to me, in a sense, in how it lends to Final Fantasy VIII's comparative warmth, I suppose, to other Final Fantasies, is characters like Odin, who's this sort of mad scientist. Now science and technology has always been presented as a very sort of dubious thing in a lot of Final Fantasy games. It's the power that man wields, often at the expense of nature. Final Fantasy VIII, from my perspective, doesn't quite present it in that way, and Odin is an interesting example of that, because where, for example, in Final Fantasy VII we have Hojo, who is this horrible, morally bankrupt sort of scientist character. Similarly, in Final Fantasy XII we have Sidolphus, who is quite sort of insane as well. Odin is this sort of eccentric guy, but he's neither good nor bad, really, in some ways. I mean, he is, for example, sort of experimenting on Eleni. I guess he's taken her, but then also he's equally willing to help us. So I just find him this fun little in-between character. I don't know if you had much of a reading on or an idea, an impression of Odin.
Well, he's so interesting, and I think it's so interesting in particular that he's in Esther, because, like you were mentioning before, like, Final Fantasy VIII has a really interesting relationship with science and technology, particularly in contrast to other games, like particularly like predecessor games like 6 and 7 are fairly clear on where they rank about. Like you were saying, the power that man has created is inherently sort of infused with the evil of man, and nature is this sort of neutral, non-aggressive, non-evil force. And Final Fantasy VIII does something interesting with that, particularly with Estar, where it's this technology, science-heavy city where people are quite nice, and it has benefited hugely from this sort of return of science and technological prowess post the sealing away of Adele. We don't have a terrible time in Estar, obviously, until the invasion starts, and then we have to fight off all these monsters. But the people there are pleasant to us. It's where we find Laguna, and Laguna is the president, and it sells the idea that this heartland of science and man's power can not only be wielded correctly, but also is inherently a very positive thing that's brought a lot of growth and a lot of happiness to people's lives. If you just had that in Estar, and even if you look at Galbadia, like, you have the the garden schools. They're an example of like a form of technology. They're not they're sort of magic, but they're, you know, they're fixed up by the FH technicians. There's something man-made. There's something very positive. There's a lot of technology used in the garden that's not inherently this evil thing, even in Galbadia. But then Odin arrives in Esthar, and he's this creepy little man, and he, like you said, he's not all evil. He will experiment on children, but he's more self-serving. Like, yeah, he's terrible. He experiments on children, but he's nice to us. But he's just more self-serving. He doesn't really care which way the wind blows as long as he can kind of ride that wave. He's willing to align himself with Adele if that furthers his own scientific interests and if it furthers his own scientific inquiries. And then he's also willing to help us because he thinks that maybe Adele might be a hindrance, or he wants to get it under her control. He's really very self-serving, and I often wonder the purpose of including him in there, because they had done the mad evil scientist thing, like you said, in Final Fantasy VII, and he's not even he's a mad scientist, but he's quite comical. Like, he's this tiny little man with he has like a clown's ruff around his neck. Like, he's almost portrayed sort of like a court jester. Like, he's very cartoonish. And I often, he's one of those characters I really can't for certain get a read on why he's there, because I do agree with what you said, that characters aren't wasted in Final Fantasy VIII. And I wonder if it has something to do with the single-minded pursuit of advancements in technology and of science makes a person unreliable and makes them this sort of self-centered, self-minded person like Odin. Because, you know, he has created things that we as the characters in the game find useful. He creates the Odin bangle that Rinoa tries to give to Sorcerer Zadia. Like, he's such a grey figure, but I think for me he's so grey that I can't really get a read on him at all.
I think he is a hard character to really get a handle on and read, and as you say, it's like the comical appeal and appearance of him really kind of juxtaposes, and I suppose makes you sort of made me anyway, like, sort of not really take in the severity of, he is kidnapping and experimenting on children, but he's a funny little man. So it's like such a solid contrast in one character. Yeah, it's quite funny there. Happy to leave that on the point of ambiguity, but I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts on Odin there. So I think, sort of drawing to a close now, I'm aware in terms of NPCs in Final Fantasy VIII, there is a glaring omission thus far, which is Eleni, or Elone. I'm kind of hesitant to discuss her in this sort of secondary, tertiary NPC discussion, because actually I think she is a major character in Final Fantasy VIII. She's actually in a lot of ways the narrative backbone and a catalyst for a lot of the things that happen. You know, she is this link between Squall and Squall and Laguna, and so on. And we have, of course, discussed her, I think, to a reasonable degree on the discussion that we had over on the Gamedove channel when we were discussing Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X. So if anyone wants a lengthier discussion, including Eleni, please go over and check that out. Yeah, I think I'm happy to wrap things up now. Did you have any closing remarks? Or
no, just to say thank you so much for having me on, and I've had a great time, and yeah, it's been a lovely chat.
And please plug yourself. Where can people find you?
Oh God, you guys can find me on YouTube at Gamedove, and I'm nowhere else because I'm afraid of people. So you can see me at YouTube at Gamedove.
Excellent. Thanks very much. It was great speaking with you today, and yeah, I'll catch you soon.